Thank you for joining. Our speakers today are Kate Holl. Kate's been a woodland advisor with Nature Scott and its predecessors for almost 40 years, specialising in assessing woodland habitat condition, particularly the evaluation of herbivore impacts in natural woodlands. She's a joint author of the Woodland Herbivore Impact Assessment Method, and in 2017, under a Churchill Fellowship, travelled widely within the northeastern Atlantic bioregion to learn about the flora of woodlands less impacted by herbivores. So Kate will be presenting first, and then after Kate will be Thomas Ward Crowther, and he's a professor of ecology and the founding co-chair of the advisory board for the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. He's the head of Crowther Lab, an interdisciplinary research group exploring the role of biodiversity in regulating Earth's climate. In 2020, he founded Restore, an international organisation that supports hundreds of thousands of local community restoration initiatives across the globe. He was a finalist in Prince William's Earthshot Prize, and the World Economic Forum recognised him as a young global leader for his contributions to global nature conservation. So thanks to Kate and Tom for joining us today. I really appreciate it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Kate and ask Kate to share her screen, please.
Thank you so much, Jonny. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk this afternoon. Hello, I'm going to be talking about the lost understory. And I wonder whether you ever wonder what woodlands would look like if there were fewer herbivores munching on them. I'm going to be talking this afternoon about the health of our woodlands in relation to large herbivore impacts. I'm going to be sharing some examples from around Scotland of the work of inspiring pioneers over the last 40 years. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about, as Jonny mentioned, what woodlands that are less impacted by herbivores elsewhere within the Atlantic bioregion look like, as I learned through a Churchill Fellowship to travel in 2017. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about what all this means in terms of the biodiversity and climate crisis. So I am going to be talking a lot about the problem of deer in woodland and natural vegetation generally. So I want to make it clear at this point that deer per se are not a problem in woodland ecosystems. I'm sure you're all well aware of that. Indeed, they are an integral part of a healthy woodland. The issue is that in Britain, we have eliminated the predators that would naturally regulate their numbers and keep them within the ecosystem's carrying capacity. Without predators or adequate population management through culling, prey species populations tend to increase until there's nothing left for them to eat, at which point their numbers crash. As we artificially supplement the diets of deer in the uplands through feeding, and in the lowlands through growing arable crops through the winter, their numbers have not crashed, but have steadily increased since the 18th century, with dire consequences, not just for our woodlands, but for all natural vegetation, as we shall see. Okay, where did this all begin? I suppose I have been looking at herbivore impacts for a very long time. And despite looking at herbivore impacts for years, I didn't really realize quite how much these animals impact our woods until one day I happened upon a woodland that had been securely fenced against herbivores for more than 30 years. This woodland, which is at the south end of the island of Mull, had an understory, and it was full of flowers, so was completely different to most Scottish woods I had ever visited. Several hundred years of deer and sheep browsing over the land has left our woods without their filling. They have a canopy and a field layer, but everything in between has been eaten away. Very unusually, the fence around this woodland, which was put up over 30 years ago, had remained deer-proof all that time. Most deer fences don't last anywhere near that amount of time. And as a result, there were regenerating trees in this woodland. There were lots of shrubs and climbing plants. And in the field layer, there were flowers, lots of them. Outside the fence, and I'm going to show you what it looks like outside the fence. So if I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that is the fenced woodland there. And the hills outside are a bit misty, but they don't have a lot of anything on them actually. And I suddenly realized that because of the impact of herbivores, it's not just the woodland that was being affected, but it was everything that would otherwise grow if it was not constantly being eaten by deer or sheep. These grazing animals are impacting everything in the ecosystem. And this might sound a really obvious thing to say, but I don't believe we have fully embraced the consequences of that statement. I returned to the enclosure a couple of years later to discover that the deer fence had been taken down. The job of regenerating the woodland was considered to have been done. And I'll show you a picture which I took from the same spot 2 years later. And it's very different, but you can possibly see that the sapling in the middle of the top picture, there's the same sapling in the bottom picture. If you can, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but anyway, take my word, it's taken from the same spot. In less than 2 years, with the herbivores back in, all the flowers had gone. All that ecological productivity and species and structural richness that had taken over 30 years to develop was gone. And a few sapling trees were all that there was to see of the abundance of flowering plants that this wood had come to support. The rest had been eaten or trampled into oblivion. Okay, so the wood in this picture is typical of many in Scotland. Indeed, most Scottish woods look like this, as in there is no understory and there has been no tree regeneration for more than 100 years. You shouldn't be able to see through a healthy woodland. There should be an understory. There should be mature trees and old trees, but there should also be sapling trees and young trees. There should also be shrubs and climbing plants such as honeysuckle, ivy, sprawling plants such as bramble, raspberry, and so on, and low shrubs such as blaeberry, as well as the full range of flowering plants that would naturally grow there. If you can easily walk through a wood off the path, then it's not a fully thriving woodland, but a depleted habitat lacking a huge part of its natural anatomy. It's filling. Okay, so through observation, we're beginning to understand the full extent of the impacts of herbivores in woodland, and that it's not just about their impact on tree regeneration. There are now so many herbivores in our countryside, both domestic and wild, that palatable plants are mostly browsed out of existence. So they're either no longer present at all, or if they are present, they are only present vegetatively, which means they don't get to flower. Flowers often contain important phytochemicals and sugars, so they are selectively browsed by herbivores, which means the plants don't get the chance to set seed and reproduce. The absence of seeded regeneration restricts the genetic diversity of plants, and that limits or is limiting their resilience to changing climate and pests and pathogens. The impact of herbivores on tree regeneration has, of course, long been recognized and resulted in a number of decades of woods being wrapped in fences to keep the deer out. However, deer fences are only a temporary solution. Unless we deal with the expanding deer population, as soon as a deer fence becomes vulnerable, and that happens as soon as a tree falls on it, the deer get back in, and with their numbers can quickly undo decades of restoration, as we've already seen. So despite the huge cost of all this fencing, the fences have actually achieved very little in terms of restoring woodland, apart from in some woods, of course, getting a brief pulse of trees established as long as the fence remains intact. Right, across the landscape, there are now very few places in Scotland where it's possible to see how habitats might look if there were much lower herbivore impacts. Most of us assume, or many of us assume, that our unwooded uplands are natural, but they are far from natural. They are the product of centuries of overgrazing and extraction. They're wet deserts, as Fraser Darling named them. There are a few deer fenced exclosures, as I've said, that have remained deer proof for long enough for us to see what happens to upland vegetation when deer and sheep are excluded long term. This one, which doesn't look anything very impressive, is approximately 40 years old, 40, and is about 200 meters above the existing tree line in Argyll in Western Scotland. It shows there are a few ash trees, I don't know if you can see here, that have regenerated. So the exclosure shows that not only can trees perfectly well regenerate at this altitude in Scotland, of course, but also that the natural vegetation inside the exclosure is very different to what's outside. It's hard to see in this photo, but what is inside the exclosure is this, which is tall herb. Well, it's kind of fen vegetation, but it's a tall herb community. Tall herb vegetation is really a rare habitat across Scotland, as it's largely comprised of palatable species that are vulnerable to overgrazing. It is restricted to places inaccessible to herbivores, such as cliff ledges, steep ravines, and it's the same story with habitats like mountain woodland and scrub. With fewer herbivores in the landscape, these restricted and rare habitats might become more extensive, dramatically changing what we think of as typical upland vegetation. There are some fascinating stories unfolding around Scotland. I'm going to share a few of them with you. The first one is at Crowther Glen in the Scottish Borders hills that is providing more evidence of just what an impact herbivores or centuries of overgrazing have had on our plants and vegetation. Crowther is owned by the Borders Forest Trust and was purchased back in 2000 with the aim of recreating the wild wood long lost from the Borders Hills. The sheep were removed and a long-term commitment to deer management was made. And at that time, the glen was treeless. Now, Crowther Glen is the top picture on the right there. Thousands of trees have been planted without fences, and woodland is now happily spreading up the glen. But actually what is almost more interesting is the unanticipated consequence of removing herbivore pressure from that landscape for 2.5 decades, which has allowed the native plants to recover, to grow, to flower, to seed and reproduce, and in the process provide resources for a wide variety of associated species that are returning to the glen. The adjacent glen, which is seen in the picture below, is what Crowther Glen looked like 25 years ago, but it is grazed not only by sheep and deer, but also goats. And the uniformity of the vegetation here is in stark contrast to Crowther. Typically, it's species-poor acid grassland with some patchy heather. The complete absence of any sort of woodland or scrub clearly shows what an impact the herbivores are having and continuing to have there, limiting the species richness, the structural diversity, and the ecological productivity of the vegetation of this area. It's a big deal. So the expansion and species richness of the tall herb vegetation that I mentioned previously in relation to the exclosure in Argyll has been the most striking change over the 25 years since herbivores were removed. Previously, this stuff was confined to the cliff ledges, but well, as it is all over Scotland. But with the reduction in herbivore pressure, the tall herb community has come down off the cliffs and is spread all over the lower ground, particularly the river shingle. And plants such as mountain sorrel, which is this one here, which is normally only found at in montane habitats, is now abundant all over the river shingle. So it's hardly behaving like a mountain plant. This outcome really makes you wonder about things like the current distribution and extent of rare plants and habitats in Scotland, and just how widespread these might otherwise be in a landscape that's not so totally limited and degraded by herbivores. Here's another example that is just stunning, frankly. At Crowther Estate in the Northwest Highlands, the current owners have been actively reducing deer numbers, bringing them from around 16 per square kilometre in 2006 to an impressive 0.8 deer per square kilometre in 2021. There are no deer fences and no sheep, and all the trees have been planted without tubes to protect them. But here too, one of the most impressive changes has been to the tall herb vegetation, which has come down off the crags and is spreading over the lower ground. And what a stunning show of flowers. Again, it just makes you think. You don't see this sort of stuff when you're walking in the Scottish hills normally. And these pictures make you wonder about how much more biodiverse our hills could be with fewer herbivores. Yeah. So kind of begs the question, what would our woods look like with fewer herbivores? And it's a good question. We don't really know the answer because most of our woodlands are open to wild and domestic herbivores. And there are almost no examples where we can see what woodlands that are not degraded by centuries of overgrazing might look like. Well, almost no examples. There is a tiny rocky island that I have found off the west coast of Scotland, which is it seems to be only accessible. No, it is only accessible at low tide, but it seemingly has never been visited by sheep or deer. And under the canopy, there is an astonishing richness of flowering plants, climbing plants like ivy and honeysuckle, which are generally absent in the countryside, and they fill the understory. This tiny little bit of woodland on this tiny little rocky island here, protected by a mantle of thorn scrub, shows what is possible. But there are still no good examples in Scotland of what a mature ancient woodland that has developed throughout its lifetime with low herbivore impacts would look like in terms of the structure and composition of the woodland itself and of the understory. So in 2017, I was fortunate to secure a Churchill Fellowship, which gave me the chance to travel and seek some answers to the question, where have all the flowers gone? And over 6 weeks, I traveled to 4 countries, visited lots of woods and spoke to lots of people. And I would like to share with you some of the findings of that project. The Isle of Wight was one of the first places I went to, which technically didn't really qualify. The Churchill Fellowship, you're supposed to travel outside the UK, but I managed to argue that the Isle of Wight was far enough away from Scotland to qualify as a foreign country. And the Isle of Wight is a really interesting place to go if you're interested in woodland ecology, because the woods have been largely free of the impacts of herbivores for 150 years. As according to historical records, deer were hunted to extinction on the island in the 1870s, and as such, these woods are pretty unique in the UK, and so an important place to study woodland processes in the absence of herbivore impacts. Woodlands on the island have a well-developed understory full of palatable species such as bramble, honeysuckle, dogrose, ivy, hazel, holly, and super abundant ferns. The woodland canopy species all freely regenerate. And as a result of the long period of no grazing or browsing, these woods have developed a structural complexity that is unknown in Scottish woods. In fact, we now use pejorative terms such as rank to describe woods such as these, as we've become so used to our park-like overgrazed woods. 69% of the woods on the island have dormice and 86% have red squirrel. Both these species are rare or absent from woods across the rest of the UK, which are all grazed by deer to a greater or lesser extent. Critical for both of these species to survive and thrive is the amount of bramble, honeysuckle and ivy in the scrubby understory that provides cover and food. Dormice make their nests in old clumps of honeysuckle and ivy that grow up tree stems, and they feed on the flowers, which is a rich source of nectar and pollen protein. In overgrazed woods, these species never get to flower and are confined to the ground layer where they neither flower. They're confined to the field layer where they don't flower, and therefore they're providing neither food nor habitat. The quality of the woodland understory is also likely to be a very important factor in the value of the Isle of Wight woods for bats, and in particular Bechstein's bat, which is frequent in the woods of the Isle of Wight. And ecologists there believe that this is because the understory in the woodlands provides habitat for the insects that the bats feed on. Bechstein's is now one of the UK's rarest bats, having previously been one of the commonest, and its decline is probably linked to the loss of understory from many of Britain's woodlands due to the increasing impacts of herbivores, large herbivores. There are some studies that have looked specifically at the impact of deer browsing on woodland biodiversity, but there is evidence, and there is evidence that the impact of grazing on vegetation structure is reducing the abundance and species richness of a wide range of invertebrates. It's not surprising, and therefore there are knock-on effects on related higher trophic levels, such as birds, insectivorous mammals, and so on, through reduced prey abundance. Okay. So the next place I went to was southwest Norway, and that's another really interesting place to go if you're interested in woodland ecology, because surprisingly, if you don't know the history of southwest Norway, prior to the 1950s, it was largely devoid of trees due to burning and grazing by livestock and deer, and looked pretty much like the uplands of Scotland do today. But southwest Norway, for those of you who've been, will know it's now a very forested region, and the majority of that, the vast majority of that, has arisen through natural regeneration. How did this happen? Well, the dramatic transformation in land cover was due to a combination of social factors resulting in land abandonment, combined with a coincident decline in wild deer to do with overhunting. The land was left then to slowly recover under nature's direction, and in the intervening 70 years or so has transformed from an open grazed landscape to a predominantly wooded one, entirely through natural regeneration. There is now so much forest and consequently so much browse in the understory for the deer to eat that for the most part the deer have little obvious impact on woodland processes. So they are there in reasonable numbers, and they are eating the woodland and they are eating the understory, but their impacts are sustainable and not diminishing the quality of the woodland. So the woods of southwest Norway are now, as I said, another really great place to go and visit and get a sense of what a healthy woodland could look like. visited lots of woods and different woodland types in Norway. They all had really well developed understory. The most impressive, I think, was this one, which has been free of the impacts of herbivores since the 1940s. It's a youngish wood, but in spite of that, it's developing good structural diversity. And one of the really interesting things was the ancient honeysuckle, which is crazy in this wood. In Scotland, as I mentioned, although honeysuckle is present in most woods, due to overgrazing, it's mostly confined to the field layer. So it just is a very straggly plant that you see in amongst the grass of the field layer. And so it rarely flowers and therefore rarely flutes. And that has consequences up the food chain, as I've already mentioned. Plants like honeysuckle and ivy, they need to get up into the canopy in order to flower. And in this Norwegian woodland, as you can see in the bottom picture here, the honeysuckle vines were ancient, snaking along the ground, and then they would pull themselves up into the woodland canopy, where they were just a mass of flowers and, of course, full of insects and all the other associated fauna. Wonderful. Right. And then one of the other places I visited was Iceland. Iceland is interesting because it's 700 miles north of Scotland in the North Atlantic, where plants have to deal with pretty challenging environmental conditions. But Iceland, if for those of you who know it, it has not always been as treeless as it is today. And there are some books that were written, the Icelandic sagas, about the process of settlement of Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries by the Norse. And one of the sagas, the Book of Icelanders, if you're interested, describes Iceland at the time of settlement as being wooded from firth to fell. And elsewhere in that saga, it's mentioned that the island was so thickly wooded that travel into the interior was too difficult, and so exploration of the island at that time had to be via incursions from the sea. Amazing. However, as settlement progressed, more and more of the forest was cut down, and then increasing numbers of grazing animals prevented its recovery, so that by the early 1900s, the overgrazing had led to the almost total depletion of Iceland's forests. Several of the woodland remnants were protected from grazing now for more than 100 years, and birch has spread within these fenced areas. And the picture here shows one of the biggest remnants at a place called Þingvellir. These remnants have remained protected from grazing to this day, and they provide an amazing insight to the potential for woodland ecosystem development in the absence of grazing, even in a place as environmentally challenging as Iceland is. So the flowers were incredible. The fruiting shrubs common in the understory, good structural diversity, and the understory vegetation lush and full of tall flowering plants such as wood cranesbill, hawkweed, stone bramble, lady's mantle, and even herb Paris, which was a particularly surprising discovery. Yeah. Okay, so the fellowship.
Just to let you know, Kate, you've got 5 minutes left. 5 minutes.
Yep. That's fine. Thank you very much. The fellowship gave me the chance to travel and visit woods comparable to Scottish woods, but without the recent history of herbivore impacts. And it was really enlightening. What I saw enabled me to draw some conclusions. So as I've mentioned, there are whole habitats that are made up of palatable species which are missing, just simply absent from our landscapes, or else they have retreated to inaccessible places. And we now tend to think of them as characteristic of those inaccessible places, somewhat mistakenly, I would suggest. Ecological productivity at the landscape scale in Scotland is now low. And this has implications for ecosystem diversity as well as for economic productivity. So it affects our ability to derive livelihoods from the land. And finally, the resilience of our habitats, because so few of the plants in them get to flower in the face of changing climate, is diminished because the woodland plants are not getting to develop their genetic diversity through flowering and setting seed. And all of these issues are, I would propose, entirely a result of the long history of overgrazing and not a consequence of or intrinsic to the Scottish environment. As well as its importance for biodiversity, the woodland understory is also an important part of the carbon sequestration potential of natural woodland that has been largely overlooked until very recently. How much more carbon could there be stored in a woodland like the one on the right compared to the one on the left? Our current understanding is that around 75% of carbon that's sequestered in Scottish woodlands in the soil. Only 13% of it is in the trees. If shrubs and understory trees are included in the calculation, it would significantly increase the total carbon store. Recent research has shown that if you include the understory in the calculations, there may be as much as a third again of the quantity of carbon stored in the woodland that is currently stored in the trees. But there needs to be a lot more research looking at that. And the trouble is that very few of our woodlands have understory where this can be investigated. Yeah, so it isn't just about the big things in the understory. Blaeberry is an important component of the understory as it's evergreen. It's also preferred browse in woodlands throughout the year for sheep and deer, and under this pressure it's been virtually eliminated from the understory in many upland woods. So you can see the pictures on the right show on the left, sorry, it's my right here, but the picture on the left is an unbrowsed blaeberry bush. It's over 1 meter tall, and in a browsed woodland, you can see the shoots, the leafless shoots coming out through the moss here, presumably with a very small carbon sequestration potential because it's so stunted. Okay, so as we've seen, flowers are an indicator of ecosystem health. Scotland's nature is currently the most degraded it's ever been. We're facing, as we all know, an existential crisis currently in terms of what's happening to our climate and our biodiversity, and it can all seem really quite overwhelming. However, what I hope I've shown in this talk is that while things are indeed in a bad place right now, there are beacons of inspiration where pioneers around the country are leading the way in taking action, reducing herbivore impacts and helping nature to recover. And this reduction in herbivore impacts will likely also help address the carbon sequestration capacity of vegetation and woodland as well. Listening to all this, you might be thinking that unless you're a landowner, there is little that you can do as an individual to bring about the change we need to see. And one thing I very much hope you take away from this talk is a conviction that change is possible and definitely within our lifetimes. And whilst you might not be a landowner, if what you heard today chimes with your own thinking, then I would encourage you to go and share your thoughts with others. In this way, we can change the belief, for it's nothing more than that the Scottish uplands are naturally treeless, and replace it with the idea that a different future landscape, better for all of us, is possible. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was fascinating, and I can't wait to invite questions in half an hour.
Thank
After
you.
we pass, so we'll pass over to Thomas Crowther now.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to present, an absolute honor to go after Kate. That was absolutely amazing and rich insight into the factors that shape Scottish landscapes and European landscapes. This is a large scale challenge. Before I start, I'm going to apologize a little bit. I'm practicing my process for integrating sound into my presentation, so apologies if these noises come through a bit loudly. But I'm going to start with a very little known fact. I was recently informed that the tin can was invented in 1810. It's not that interesting a fact on its own until you realize this was almost half a century later. The tin can was a brilliant innovation in its time, but wasn't necessarily capturing the inspiration of society. It didn't take hold for quite some time, like many of our best innovations. But we don't really have this kind of time when it comes to the innovations needed for this, our natural world, this magnificent system that has sustained us and everything we've ever known since the dawn of our evolution. And as Kate mentioned, as we're all abundantly aware, these sounds of nature are gradually fading, and they're unfortunately being replaced by essentially degraded landscapes. This is not just a climate change challenge. This isn't just about carbon emissions and biodiversity. This is a humanitarian challenge, because there's not a location on the entire planet where a degraded ecosystem is more valuable to local people than a thriving one. And as such, the idea of conservation and restoration holds real hope, but only if we can understand the fundamentals of the process. I started my career in Cardiff University trying to understand the fundamentals of how these ecosystems form. I worked with someone called Lynn Boddy, who's a legend in mycology, and we were studying how interactions between fungi can give rise to ecological stability. This is an example here. You can see one fungus, I'm going to call it fungus A, is growing over and demolishing fungus B on the Petri dish. This is very common when we put loads of fungi together. One would often outcompete the other. And what would tend to happen then is the system then dries out and collapses. But actually, sometimes, on the very rare occasion when we added a different species, that, let's call it fungus C, that would then defeat fungus A. And in some scenarios, that fungus C would also lose to fungus B. What that means is you get something like this, like a rock, paper, scissors scenario where A beats B, B beats C, and C beats A. Now, that's not a very common scenario. It's not happening all the time. Because often one will, A might beat both B and C, or vice versa. But in those scenarios, we call this an intransitive system. What happens is all three fungi tend to survive at least for a lot longer in what resembles more of a stable system. And that's kind of interesting insights into the way stability forms. But what we realized is, again, this is quite a rare scenario unless you add more fungi into the mix. When we added more and more and more fungi into more and more Petri dishes, we realized that the chances of finding those intransitive loops gets larger and larger and larger, to the extent that once we added 9 fungi into the Petri dish, beyond that point, there was never a scenario in which we didn't find an intransitive loop that would bring some form of stability within the system. And this all points towards one of the most fundamental and basic concepts in ecology that we're all abundantly aware of. And it's this idea that diversity ultimately begets diversity. Life begets life. When you have more species, you have more capacity to support more species. And it's these kind of networks that have formed the basis of my sort of ecological journey. We've been studying the network structure of these ecosystems across the entire globe. While I started in Petri dishes, we've now moved to these global scale modeling approaches. And one of the first ecosystems that we modeled in this way was actually the global forest system. This was a few years ago, just before as I was finishing my postdoc. We were the first to model the extent of this incredible global forest system. And we showed that our Earth is home, by modeling the tree density, we could find that Earth is home to just over 3 trillion trees. This was a very exciting discovery, very big new insight into the state of our planet. We were immediately criticized for missing the trees in the Vatican City, so we had to update the number immediately. But we're still talking about a massive ecological system which supports everything that we all life on Earth, along with all the other ecosystems that support us. But these models don't only help us to understand where forests exist now, they can help us to understand where they might naturally exist. So by removing the influence of human activity from these machine learning models, we can project where trees would naturally exist. And obviously, they've existed across a vastly larger area, almost double the scale of the current system. But what these models also revealed is that outside of urban and agricultural areas, there's a huge land of relative opportunity. about a third of the existing forested land, about 0.9 billion hectares, almost 1 billion hectares of land, is in a relatively degraded state, not overly used by human activity, but in a place where past human activity or overgrazing has led to degradation to the extent that these ecosystems are not in their full flourishing state. And actually what we realized across this 0.9 billion hectares, this third of the forested land, if we were able to allow those ecosystems to recover, we realized there's room for just over 1 trillion new trees. Now, this trillion trees alliteration had a bigger impact on my career than I ever expected anything would, because whilst we also found that these ecosystems, again, if they were able to naturally recover, yes, they could support all these trees, but those regenerating ecosystems and the soils below will be able to sequester just over 200 billion tons of carbon. Now, this is a very hypothetical concept, but that massive carbon storage potential really is in this. This really put sort of ecosystems on the map, as it were, in the conversation around climate change. It's around a third of what we need to achieve our carbon drawdown goals that were agreed in the Paris Climate Agreement. And this monumental carbon potential suddenly made this front headline news. We had no anticipation of what was coming. But this alliteration combined with this huge carbon potential, suddenly it was headline news all over the world. It gave rise to the launch of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which we're still in right now. WWF launched their Trillion Tree campaign, followed by another Trillion Tree campaign from the World Economic Forum. And when the president of the United States starts planting trees on the White House lawn, you think this is too good to be true. And of course, that's exactly what it was, because we're all abundantly aware of the risks of misinterpretation in this scenario, because many people saw this as a chance to just plant blankets of carbon capturing trees, monocultures of simplicity that are pretty devastating for the climate movement. They're obviously even worse for the biodiversity movement. And it led to a really difficult phase of academic controversy where people debated and disputed the role of nature in climate change altogether. And for me personally, it was a really emotional and difficult time. I was criticized by some of the scientists that I respect most highly in this field for all sorts of things. The people said that our numbers were wildly wrong. No way 200 gigatons can be captured. I was called an armchair ecologist and more creative insults along the way. But then what happened is it gave rise to a new wave of media. Instead of focusing on the incredible power of nature to help us in our regenerative livelihoods and our sustainable livelihoods, and with climate as a wonderful sort of co-benefit, instead they were focusing on the risks of restoration done wrong. And of course, I'm certain there's not a single person on this call who's not aware that the wrong tree in the wrong place can do more harm than good. It's sort of worth noting that this is obviously the case for everything that has ever existed. I joke that you stick a toothbrush in the wrong place, it can do more harm than good. Obviously, we can't be over-engineering our way out of this system. But it was really difficult because these headlines they're not, in their, I would argue, quite extreme stances. Either trees are the best thing in the world or they're destroying the world. This is really, it drove a wedge between climate and nature conservation people. At that time, there was a lot of people saying that nature is a distraction from climate change, that it's any efforts to conserve or restore nature is greenwashing, and it can be a dangerous distraction from efforts to decarbonize, which is obviously so contrary, because we fundamentally need these ecosystems if we're going to survive, let alone fight climate change. And of course, they play a very central role. So rather than sort of fighting back against these headlines, we realized that a more constructive thing was to go back to all the people on either side of the argument, both sides of this debate, and we invited them all to collectively join forces to build a new scale of study, this time with millions of observations around the world, ground-sourced observations where people stood on the ground calculating the amount of carbon in their forests. And with this combination of ground-source data and satellite observations, we were able to generate a more robust understanding that showed us, in fact, that we hadn't been overestimating the carbon storage potential of forests. We've been underestimating it. These ecosystems have staggering potential to help us in our fight against climate change. But this time we could see how that could actually be achieved, because of course, ecosystems are not going to be storing much carbon unless they are in their complex, this diverse state where each species depends on other species to survive. Again, it's this basic foundational principle of ecology, which means that according to our calculations, the average natural system was storing about 53% more carbon on average than the equivalent monocultures over a large timescale. Now, of course, that is partially due to the resilience benefits and the niche differentiation that happens when you have complex ecosystems. But it meant that we can't really be over-engineering our way out of this problem. And this time, when the second study came through, the headlines followed suit, and they sort of matched our where we wanted to be at with this messaging, highlighting in fact the potential of diverse, ancient, old, healthy ecosystems to achieve to help us in our climate goals. And this time it wasn't just the sort of media headlines, it was the scientific responses in those headlines, in those articles, that really gave us confidence to move forward, saying that the findings provide clarity and confidence, that the take-home messages are foundational and correct. And actually our harshest critic from 2019 summarized the work of about 400 scientists over 5 years as reasonable, which was best feedback I'll ever get. I'll take that to the bank. But it wasn't just the scale of these numbers. In fact, I was contacted by colleagues in Brussels who were negotiating the EU restoration law at the time, who described that it's not really about how big the numbers are, the scale of this potential. Really, it's just about the level of consensus building that helps them to move forward, that helps them to find the can opener to take steps forward for their EU restoration negotiations. Now, of course, we're abundantly aware that EU restoration law has also now been met with striking concerns, like people marching in the streets, marching against the nature protection laws because they're concerned that nature will come at the expense of food production, of jobs, of livelihoods. And these are, of course, completely reasonable concerns, understandable concerns. But they're also based on a bit of a misconception of our relationship with nature. There's this idea of a trade-off between people and nature. And we've had this idea of a linear trade-off for a very long time. In fact, it's undermined several civilizations before us, including the ancient Mayan civilization, including, even giant massive civilizations like Greece and Rome have had massive areas where ecological collapse gave rise to societal collapse. When agricultural systems start to collapse, we fundamentally need to find a balance with these ecosystems so that we can maintain the stability of landscapes, so that we can maintain the pollinators, the predators that regulate those herbivores, and all the other ecosystem, climate regulation, soil fertility, and the things that we need to survive. But now we're at this point where nature is with growing. I think there's growing awareness on the international and intercontinental policy stages that nature is important. It's got a central role in the climate negotiations. It's present in every COP. The question really is, how do we go about achieving that? And of course, from an ecological perspective, one of the top priorities is to protect what we have now, try to protect what still remains. But then on top of that, we have to try to revitalize what we possibly can. And that revitalizing or restoration obviously doesn't just mean banging trees in the ground. It means reconnecting ecological systems. It's rebuilding the feedback loops so that nature can survive. Again, in Kate's example, you remove the wolves and the bears, herbivores grow out of control, and then ecosystems are tipped into a more of a degraded state. We have now depleted ecosystems of many of those fundamental integral parts, which means that revitalizing them means rebuilding those connections. But I want to start with arguably the most important connection of all, and that's obviously the people. Across the planet, I think it is now widely recognized that arguably the biggest driver of degradation particularly across the global south is inequality. We've got this incredibly unequal system where we've got a few of us with massive environmental footprints and then billions of people trapped in an economy that provides no non-extractive alternatives. And this is true in the UK as it is in sub-Saharan Africa. The sort of, albeit that things are, there's huge variation in the extent of this poverty trap. But when rural poverty necessitates that people are forced against that, whether it's against their will or not, forced to degrade the ecosystems around them. That degradation, whether it's excessive nitrogen fertilizer, slash and burn farming, deforestation, whatever it is, that tends to drive further poverty, driving this terrible vicious cycle that is very difficult to get out of. But the existence of that cycle in itself is evidence that by simply changing one of these components, it is possible to turn that vicious cycle into a virtuous one. So whether it's redistributing wealth towards local communities to alleviate those economic pressures that drive degradation, that can give rise to ecological restoration. And that can, in many cases, drive improved rural livelihoods that will then go to, again, enhance the potential for further ecological restoration as the benefits are recognized by local communities. This is ultimately the goal of global restoration. It's not about finding and plant, top-down decisions to plant trillions of trees. It's about finding the millions of land stewards and turning these vicious cycles into virtuous ones. And it was this mission that a few years ago that gave rise to one of the largest international networks of scientists that I've worked with, which is this existing on the Restore network. We've built this platform essentially to democratize access to biodiversity data, carbon data, and water data. So anyone can draw around their land and they immediately get those free insights about the state of their ecosystems. And over the last 5 years, we've had this exponential growth of projects coming on board. It's entirely free, entirely transparent, entirely visible. But we now have projects spanning about 160 million hectares of land, which means governments can track projects, companies can build portfolios, and individuals can donate or volunteer or buy individual products. For the first time, we have a fully transparent, global scale ecological restoration movement. And it's these local landowners, each project driven by the local land stewards, indigenous populations or farmers who are reviving ecosystems for their own well-being, not simply for some greater collective good, but for the well-being of the landscapes that they depend on. And it's as a result of those millions of initiatives that we get this collective benefit. And I'm going to show the most preliminary study I've ever shown in a presentation. I just whipped it in this afternoon because my PhD student showed us that we've had this platform going for about 5 years, and I've been desperately waiting for this moment when we can start to track collectively how those projects are doing. This is now unbelievably preliminary, and probably, I'm sure, deeper analysis is going to change these trends. But at first glance, what we tend to see is that at the point of intervention, whether it's conservation, agroforestry, restoration, following the point of intervention across 160 million hectares, we're starting to see upward trends, about 2% increase in vegetation cover, vegetation height, and productivity across these hundreds of thousands of locations. Of course, many sites are going down. It's very difficult to get restoration right, but on average, the trend seems to be ticking generally in the right direction. And that's something that I can't believe I would ever get to see that in my lifetime. I'm very excited. But across this network, there's obviously all sorts of different projects. This is a coffee farmer in Ethiopia who grows shade-grown coffee underneath the canopy of this beautiful intact rainforest. I've actually been out to visit this site. It's unbelievable. They've got diverse mixture of native coffee trees, and because the canopy traps, or the forest traps, water and nutrients, he doesn't have any need for fertilizers or irrigation. So he's actually, this coffee production is actually more productive than some of the farms nearby that are using more contemporary approaches by removing the forest. And as a result, his increased productivity has meant that several of the farmers in the nearby region are now allowing trees to recover on their landscape so that they can have shade-grown coffee and both sell it at a higher premium and produce it more effectively and efficiently, that lowers their costs and improves their economic gains. When nature is the economic preference, it of course starts to thrive across landscapes. Like this was another community in Costa Rica. They were actually, it was a collective of farmers protecting what they call the commons, their common land, so that they could improve water drainage and improve soil stability in the landscapes around, so that they could have more productive farming. And then there's lots and lots of examples in sub-Saharan Africa like this one in the Sahel region, where they were digging drainage ditches across farms, so that water would be trapped within those systems more effectively, giving rise to little patches of vegetation that would then improve crops and rotational grazing for the following year. But in there's countless different styles of restoration, whether it's removing the deer or digging ditches or whatever it is. There's so many different approaches. All of them, every single one of these projects is ultimately limited simply by the scale and the rate at which these vegetation is likely to return. It truly is this positive feedback loop where better ecological recovery means better livelihoods. Those livelihoods are dependent on the rate of ecological return. And what often we see across these massive networks is that once they've tackled that economic challenge, the next challenges tend to be ecological. There's first and foremost, in many cases, ecological recovery is directly limited by the animals. In tropics, it tends to be the frugivores that move through and introduce seeds and nutrients that allow vegetation to return. Whereas in the higher latitudes, it tends to be the limiting effects of grazing herbivores. But arguably, an even greater effect, at least we've seen across our data set, is the effect of microbial degradation. Across all of those 0.9 billion hectares of land, ecological degradation has given rise to soil degradation. And when the soil is depleted from those vital microorganisms, that is when vegetation growth is never going to happen of its own volition. And this is obviously a really basic trend. I think we're all abundantly aware of the vital importance of microorganisms. Not just the saprotrophs and the mycorrhizal fungi, but even the pathogens are critical for propagating biodiversity within our landscapes. And when you've lost those organisms from the soil, regenerating vegetation can be a really uphill battle. Now, this seemed really obvious to us in our PhDs. I remember back in Cardiff, we had trials doing this. We had our petri dishes with our fungi, and we had lab trials showing massive changes in productivity and in growth rate of different plant species when you have the microbes present in the soil. We've even had small field trials that showed the same thing. But it was actually a few years ago when we did a large scale field study in Aberystwyth, looking at where we simply had, I can't remember how big it was. It was almost, I think it was a couple of kilometers long. This massive scale plot. I think it was about 160 different plots, each one with 10 different trees growing. And what we did is we paired those trees. So in each case, there was one tree was introduced with the healthy microbiome from essentially just a handful of soil from a nearby intact, resembling a healthy intact ecosystem. Sure, it's not in its perfect intact state, as Kate would suggest, but still a healthy forest soil. And then we'd have it next to a control plot, which simply had a handful of the more degraded or the grassland soil. And what we were absolutely astonished to find is that the vegetation recovery or the tree growth, the tree recovery in the ecosystem, in the soils that had the healthy microbiome introduced, grew more than double the rate, the ecological recovery rate. This is only a couple of years old, so we haven't anywhere near reached maturity yet. But the initial stages of growth showed massive improvements in ecological recovery. And this started us down a sort of line of ecological research that's given rise to quite a few advances in our ecological restoration topic. So one of my postdocs, Colin Averill, really jumped on this effect, and he pulled together data from all those sites across the Restore network, anyone that said that they were doing microbiome introductions. And he pulled together the data about the productivity from controlled and treatment plots, which showed consistently across the entire globe. Yes, there are some sites. Sorry, this is a bit of a unnecessarily complicated graph. The dotted line indicates no change when the microbiome is introduced, and then anything to the left indicates that the productivity went down. Anything to the right indicates that, well, biomass in this case went up. And what you can clearly see is, in fact, the average increase is a staggering 64% increase in productivity when a healthy microbiome is present relative to a degraded one. And this actually was enough for Colin to launch his own company. He's launched an organization called Fungo, which is now huge. It's based in the United States. They just did a massive partnership with Netflix, introducing healthy microbiomes into both forestry and both managed forestry sites and restoration sites to improve carbon capture. But what I found more interesting was the massive scale of the variation across these sites. In some regions, you get over 700% increases in productivity, whereas in others, you get almost nothing. And it's that variation that we realized that we could use to explore where these microbiome enrichments are most likely to occur. Because when we plotted them all out on a map, we started to see a really obvious trend. In this case, the bright colors indicate places where there was a big effect of microbiome. When you added those fungi and bacteria, you'd have a greater increase in the productivity. And across the entire globe, you can generally see this very clear trend. In the high latitudes, they didn't have such a big impact. I think these are the places where soils are rich. They're not nutrient limited. They're not moisture limited in many cases. And these are the places where introducing the healthy microbiome doesn't necessarily have such a staggering impact. Whereas in the tropics, particularly in the sub-Saharan African regions, or in dry soils or depleted soils, places where soil nutrient availability is not as high, these are the places where the loss of vegetation can lead to the loss of microbial communities that completely limit, that soil degradation is a massively limiting factor, and you can get up to 200% increases in productivity. So once we have these spatial patterns, once we've got this variation across the globe, it's quite easy for us to, again, use our machine learning models to explore these patterns and generate a model that could predict the extent to which microbial enrichment might improve productivity across the globe. I will tell you to take the white colors with a pinch of salt, because these are the deserts, and I don't think our data really works in desert regions because we didn't have any input data from there. But across the tropics, you can see that there's this massive potential for restoration rates. We predicted in one region in Uganda that we made our model predicted there'd be about 54% increases in productivity to croplands if a healthy native microbiome was introduced. And this is done in collaboration with an organization called Oath, who's working with thousands of farmers across the country to, not Uganda, did I say Rwanda? To reintroduce healthy microbiomes to improve agricultural yields of farmers, to improve productivity. And our model predicted 54% increases in yields. And what we actually found with our randomized control trials was astonishingly close. We got average yield increases of about 60%. So that was across 4 different crops. And it was really amazing to see that this massive effect happened within one growing cycle. They have 3 growing cycles per year. Within a single growing cycle, they already got a huge yield increase just by adding a handful of healthy local microbes. But what was, it's obviously very exciting to see a 60% increase in yields. What that translated to for those farmers was a $553 increase per hectare from that agricultural from that growing season, which is obviously completely game changing at those kind of scales. When we remove the ecological limitations to ecological recovery, that is when vegetation, when you start to see these like positive effects between rural livelihoods and vegetation return, when nature recovery can start to become this positive flywheel. And I'm going to leave it on arguably my favorite example. This is through the Restore Network. We've been collaborating for a very long time with Costa Rica. And actually, if you go onto the platform now, you can explore every country. You can type in any country and you can get the ecological summary for how they're doing across the planet. You can see how well they're doing for biodiversity and carbon storage. It's actually used as the reporting mechanism for the CBD, the CBD COP commitments. And what's really exciting about Costa Rica is they did this incredible payment for ecosystem service program. So about 30 years ago, like many of the countries in that region, they were experiencing huge deforestation rates to make room for cattle grazing. And instead of just allowing this to continue, what they did is they abolished the army and they distributed a lot of that money to local farmers to compensate them for allowing nature to return, for protecting nature on their land. And across thousands and thousands of farmers, this has had an incredible impact on improved vegetation cover, on tree cover, and also now we're starting to learn on the ecological integrity within those farms. And one of my favorite examples is it actually fits into this story because it was one of the oldest examples of a microbiome enrichment study. One of the farmers about 30 years ago started introducing microbiome from a nearby intact tropical forest. And the difference in the soundscape, so we've been recording the soundscapes of these payment for ecosystem service sites for the last couple of years, showing amazing differences in ecological recovery. But one sort of beautiful way of doing this is to actually look at how this soundscape varies in response to different treatments. And it showed us, and it started to reveal some really staggering trends. So this is the soundscape of a natural intact rainforest, one that has remained untouched. 30 years ago, it would have remained completely untouched. Now, what was amazing is 30 years ago, this farmer agreed that they were going to stop removing the land and allow the pasture land to recover for the benefit of to generate these payment-free ecosystem service payments. And what happened is across some of the sites, there has been an improvement. There's been this recording. You can hear, if we listen for long enough, you hear some birds and insects, but really there's a lot of static, sort of static noise, indicating that a lot of that frequency variation has been depleted. But in the sites where he introduced a healthy microbial community to the soil, over the last 30 years, the transformation has been absolutely astronomical. This blue line is about 64% of the way towards reaching the green line. So we're estimating, it's very difficult to quantify the impact of biodiversity, but this is a 64% improvement in the soundscape, the ecological intactness of that soundscape. And what you can hear in the background there is the sound of howler monkeys. There's large-bodied organisms coming through his landscape, showing that you don't get large-bodied organisms like that unless you're getting really healthy ecosystems with all the fruits and nutrients and the sort of nutrients that are available to support such large-bodied organisms. So it really is this beautiful tale of ecological recovery. Now, of course, we're seeing these patterns all across Costa Rica when we're doing these recordings, but where individuals have managed to really find those links to link back up the ecological system with the economic feedback loops, that's when you see the biggest and most beautiful recovery of nature starting to happen. And one just out of it started out of just general interest really, but in this study, which is soon to be published actually in a couple of months, we decided that we wanted to just explore how these soundscapes relate to the soundscapes of music. So we downloaded the 100,000 most frequently downloaded songs on the internet, and we correlated those soundscapes. We collapsed it all into one soundscape and correlated it with the soundscapes of these ecosystems. And we found what's beautiful is those soundscapes, while they are not statistically close at all, they are statistically closer to the soundscapes of intact, healthy ecosystems that you can hear now than they were to the degraded static of the landscape. And now, obviously, that sounds very lovely and wishy-washy, but it really is baked into our evolutionary history. We've evolved in ecosystems where the sounds of high and low frequency noises indicate the availability of foods and nutrients that we need to survive. So it's no coincidence that our musical artists over the generations have tapped into those deep evolutionary preferences to make the musical soundscapes that we tend to prefer. But the coolest thing about this Costa Rica story is that it all happened at a time of economic growth for Costa Rica. So it proves that just like Destas and those other farmers around the Restore network, that nature can be the economic choice at a national scale. As nature got baked into the cultural identity of those people, so the economy started to improve more and more and more. And this collaboration was made possible between us and Costa Rica by the Prince William's Earthshot Prize. They're encouraging governments and companies to do the same thing, because global restoration is not simply an ecological challenge. It's about reconnecting those ecological and social loops so that local people across the planet can find resilient and sustainable solutions. So we're always arguing that the solutions to this global challenge are already available to us in the ecosystems that we already have. Thank you very much for listening. I'll hand over there.
Wow, thank you so much, Tom. And it's really nice to finish on some positivity, same as Kate. Kate's finished on a very positive tone. And I was going to interrupt 5 minutes before to say like 5 minutes left, but I didn't want to interrupt a howler monkey. Never done that on a continuous cover forestry group webinar before. Absolutely fantastic. So we usually have half an hour for questions. We usually finish at 5:30, but there's quite a few questions here. What I'm going to do is ask people to put their thumbs up to ask a question. And then we'll go through them like that. So Polly, if you can just look out for people putting their thumbs up to ask questions. But I'm going to first ask the first question that came in. I think this is to you, Kate. It's from Andrew Weatherall at the RSPB. He questions about the impact of deer. You said that deer weren't necessarily the problem, but he argues maybe it's the non-native deer species in the UK that are really the problem, rather than the numbers of deer. Have you got anything to say on that, on non-native deer and numbers, and what you think about that?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for your question. My experience is mainly based in Scotland, so we don't really have the same issues with non-native deer that you've got in the south of England. But what I would say is that regardless of whether you're dealing with native or non-native species, and it doesn't matter really whether it's deer or trees or squirrels, it is about looking at the balance between the species. I mean, it is possible for non-native species to be ecological analogues of native species, but also the opposite can happen, where they are leading to an imbalance in the ecosystem. And so I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, it could well be that the non-native deer are having that effect in the south of England. But it is, as I said in my talk, it's to do with the lack of predators. And with the lack of predators, with the lack of our intervention to replace the role that natural predators would have. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Kate. Great. We've got some questions. Question here on well, perhaps I ask Ian Hanna if Ian Hanna wants to maybe you want to ask your question directly. There's a couple of questions here. And just indicate if you want the question to Kate, Tom, or both. No, maybe, is he still there? Maybe he might have left. Hello, Ian. Is Ian there?
Ian is still there.
Okay. Okay. Well, there's a couple of questions here. One to do with comparisons with other latitudes in other countries. Like he's given the example of Slovakia. And he's asking about comparable metrics for stored carbon in vegetation, species diversity, and soil condition compared to woodlands that are unmanaged, with unmanaged browsing in the UK. So the best examples of woodland at our latitude, what would be the comparable metrics for stored carbon compared to those woodlands with unmanaged browsing? Could we say anything on that, do you think?
Okay, I assume that's aimed at you again, given the browsing focus.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question. Is it about the comparison between different forest systems and different, or?
Yeah, I think he's trying to get at the fact that other countries at our latitude, how they might compare in terms of the metrics for carbon in vegetation, and if there's anything that you can refer to on that from other countries.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't. I mean, I did dig into the literature for Britain because I'm most concerned with Britain, because that's really where my focus has been. But in doing that, I looked at other European literature, and there has been some work in Poland that I looked at. But really, natural forest systems have just not had the intensity of investigation, I would say, certainly in the British kind of context. People just are not looking at semi-natural or natural woodland. in, for answers to these questions, and I would argue they should be. There may be stuff in the literature in other European countries that's not available in English that I didn't see, but my sense is that this is kind of an opening field of work that people have done some work in it, and there's a lot more to be done to understand just what the potential is.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So and if anybody would like to ask a question, please just put your thumb up. There's no Q&A facility in the Zoom here, so please put your thumb up, and we'll come to you and invite you to ask your question to the speakers. So there's a message here from Andrew Newton on silvicultural management. Has there been any observation as to there being less silvicultural management due to more protected features in naturally recovered woodlands, like in other countries? And he says there seems to be a huge potential for increasing competing single issue tensions in already deprived habitats. So maybe Tom, do you know much about how silviculture, approach to silviculture might be, might allow complex ecosystems, to restore in the UK or elsewhere?
Yeah, again, unfortunately, I'm not. I couldn't tell you about the statistics of how silviculture has been responding relative to conservation or other practices, but I do know that there's been, at least on our platform, on our network, silviculture is like such a massive and growing component of ecosystem restoration. It's such a vital approach for getting productivity, for getting timber, but also for promoting biodiversity, and for the more regenerative and sustainable approaches. You see more and more people integrating new things. But unfortunately, I couldn't talk to you about. Of course, there's always land use conflicts. This is the whole challenge in the ecosystem movement. There is not a pixel of land on the planet where there aren't people with different approaches for what might potentially be there. So I'm a big fan of proposing a full diversity of approaches and in all possible scenarios. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the stats on the extent of the trade-offs.
Okay, and Kate, have you got anything to say on woodland management, silviculture in that respect?
Well, again, my work has been in natural woodland, not plantation or woodlands that are managed primarily for product. But there is no reason why we cannot apply an ecological way of thinking to the way in which we manage our woodlands to improve the outcome for carbon sequestration, water retention, and all of these kind of parameters that we're interested in improving. And indeed, your own group, the Continuous Cover Forestry Group, is kind of all about this, isn't it? I mean, I saw in the chat there was a comment about clear felling having an impact on fungal communities, and I've also seen research about what a dramatic, and Tom may have something to say on this, but what a dramatic effect. And it's a no-brainer, really. It's fairly obvious to anybody who's thinking in an ecological way, cut down all the trees, that this is going to have a massive impact on lots of things, and it does. So the research is bearing that out. But I think the clever thing that we could be doing at this point is designing systems that meet our economic and social needs and so on, around systems that also are more sustainable and are addressing some of these other factors that we've been talking about in the last hour.
Great.
So there's no reason why silvicultural systems couldn't, in Britain at the moment and around the world generally. I think they don't. But that's one of the things we need to address, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a question here, Ian, Hannah, this is probably to you, Tom. Do we know what contribution to soil carbon storage is made by fungi and all their structures, hyphae, etc., as opposed to accumulated vegetable matter in the soil? He says, my understanding is that woodlands with a diverse tree species and age structure will be reflected in a more complex fungal system, which would presumably also make a more significant contribution to soil carbon storage.
So yeah, funnily enough, we just at the end of last year published a paper in Global Change Biology, in case you're interested, looking at the relative, quantifying across the globe the relative contributions of microbial necromass, or in woodlands it's mainly fungal necromass, versus the tree inputs. And it's funny because historically we always thought, oh, it's mostly plant litter that's forming soil organic carbon. Then a few years ago, a lady called Francisca Cortrufo did this incredible sort of paradigm changing study that showed actually plants through their litter and exudates nourish this community of microbes, and it's actually after microbial death that you get soil organic formation. So everyone's sort of tipped and started thinking that most soil carbon comes through the microbes, but actually we realize it's about half and half. So half of the soil organic matter is accumulated after rounds of decomposition, and then you get sort of aggregates of soil getting sort of micronutrients and carbon compounds getting trapped in aggregates of soil. But then about 50% comes following incorporation into the microbial community. And it is very true. The richer the plant, the richer the world, the more diverse the community above, the richer and more diverse the community below ground. And you get a healthier accumulation of soil carbon when you have that diversity.
Interesting. Thank you for that. So there's somebody's got their hand up. FW, I'm not sure what it stands for. Farmers Weekly, if you'd like to ask you a question.
Yeah, hi, it's Fergus Williams, just for your interest.
Oh, hi, Fergus.
Hey, it just struck me. I think, Kate, you said 75% of this carbon storage is in the soil, or maybe that was Tom, and 30% in the trees, or 25% in the trees, and with a potential of an increase of a third to that carbon storage in the understory, in a healthy understory. And that probably tells a very good story around CCF and what we're trying to do, in that there's no clear fell. We're selecting trees to take out. We're not disturbing the soil very much. So I think that's a really encouraging story for what actually this group is about, and how this practice should be pushed onto, Forestry England and all that a bit harder, because if the story is about carbon, then surely this is the way to go.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, on to you.
Sorry,
yeah.
Yeah, well, I give, like, globally, those are the stats. So yeah, about 75%. Soil stores about 3 times more carbon than vegetation across the globe. But actually, in the UK, in the higher latitudes, that proportion's even higher. So it probably around 80% of the carbon in an ecosystem will be in the soil. The understory vegetation, I don't know. I guess that was Kate's point. Okay, I think you were saying the 30%.
Yeah, I mean, Fergus, thanks for your question. There's really very little research that's looked at this, and it's probably partly because there isn't much of an understory in most of our woods, so it's a really hard thing to look at. But they did do a study at Monk's Wood. It was a non-destructive study where they estimated the volume of carbon stored in the understory, and they estimated that it was about a third again was in the understory, as was contained in the trees. There's been some more recent work that Nancy Burrell has been doing, looking at the carbon sequestered in the scrub at Knepp. And they did do a destructive survey. So they actually pulled up the hawthorn bushes and and worked out exactly how much carbon was in not just the bushes but their roots as well. And I don't have the data. You can Google it and find her postdoc work. Very interesting. There is a lot of carbon. I know it's not very statistical, but there is a lot of carbon stored in the understory. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's about minimizing the intervention in the woodlands so that that store of carbon is not disturbed and maintained, and continuous cover forestry has got to be part of the way forward here, I think. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
So
Yeah,
could I
thank you.
actually just come back and could I give another answer to that? Because
Yeah.
it is a really good point. I want to sort of stress that. So I'm in the like quantitative ecology space, right, where people are constantly debating about, there's more carbon stored in grasslands than in forests, or there's more carbon stored in this than that. And I think essentially whether it's 30% or 3%, it doesn't really matter, because the understory like builds the carbon storage potential in the trees and the soil dramatically anyway. So even if it was 1% of the carbon was in the understory, the ecosystem increase is dramatic because of that understory. So it really enhances soil productivity and vegetation growth in the trees. So whatever the answer is, it's critically important, essentially is what I'm saying.
Yeah, great.
And we also forget that carbon is in living creatures as well. So, as you build the ecosystem and those species come back in, they're all bringing carbon and holding carbon as well. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So got a couple more minutes, so maybe just two more questions. Question here on the microbiota. So question here for you, Tom. How do you know what an appropriate microbiota is for a given soil or vegetation species mix?
It's a good question. In this case, in all the studies I've just been talking about, we don't manipulate it. We don't choose. We just go to the nearest approximate of a healthy ecosystem. And again, I mentioned the thing, as Kate mentioned, it's very hard to find a fully healthy ecosystem, but we do our best. You just, if you're in a place like where I am in the Swiss Alps, you just go to the nearest intact forest, and we take a handful of soil and we'll integrate it. We've done studies in regions where we've done microbiome transplants from moorlands but essentially anything that approximates a wilderness is what we've been going with. But there are lots of people. In fact, that organization that I mentioned called Oath is trying to build microbiomes that are geography specific. So they in different geographies they will culture microbial communities that are the most dominant communities for about 100 or 120 different microbial species in a sort of consortium that they then add in liquid culture. And there's other people who do I can't remember what it's called. It's something like compost tea. They drain water through composted material to extract some microbes and then introduce that. So there's a few different ways of doing it, but all the studies I talked about were just taking soil from a nearby wild place.
And the name of the company, I think was it called Funga?
So Funga is actually, yeah, true. I mentioned two companies. Funga they're really flying. They've got they do that. They take a handful of soil and they put it in a forestry situation, and they are actually making the improvement in forest growth is enough for them to. So they work with foresters to they sort of take carbon credits for the extra percentage that was introduced, extra percentage of carbon gain that happened as a result of the microbial of the soil introductions. And the other one is called Oath, and they are culturing microbial communities in a lab and introducing them into farmers' soils to improve productivity in farmland in sub-Saharan regions. So yeah, Funga is probably more relevant for this group.
Wow, yeah, that's quite sophisticated. I haven't got to the point where I've actually need to approach a company for fungal microbiomes yet, but maybe that'll happen at some point soon. Yeah, I'm just looking at the time. We're maybe just a couple more minutes, and then that'll be it. Question here from Miles Drury. He says most of the focus seems to be on increasing carbon stored in biomass and soils. Any thoughts on the wider picture of the bioeconomy considerations using renewable resources to reduce reliance on fossil fuel derived products? I guess that's to you, Tom.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, and it seems like a highly contentious issue, actually. There's some people who think it's wonderful. I guess, as Kate mentioned, with any product with anything you grow, you can do so in an ecologically minded way, or you can do so in a massive monoculture. And I guess the latter is really destructive. But there's definitely I think a very steadily growing bioeconomy that's really producing a lot. But it's not that, yeah, that's not part of my field of study, so I'm not an expert in that region.
Okay, and another question here for you, Kate, on bat roosts. Question about how does the availability of bat roost features compare in the Isle of Wight Woods? It says, is there a more even age structure of the tree population, including veteran trees and standing deadwood with more roost features? Can you remember anything to do with that?
Oh gosh, good question. I'm sure those are important factors that play into it. So that statement that I made in my talk was harvested from the people who are working in the Isle of Wight, and so this is not my own personal work. This is I'm really reporting what other people have observed, and their kind of observations were leading them to think that it was to do with the understory and the invertebrates that were in the understory of those woods that is lacking in so many of our mainland British woods, which do have big old trees, veteran trees and ancient trees. So I tend to feel that it is more to do with the understory than the presence or absence of bat roosts, where they are available in the other woods. I don't think that's a limiting factor, is what I'm trying to say, in our other British woods. I think there's plenty of big old trees for bats to nest in semi-natural, natural woodland. It's the lack of an understory, which I think is the critical factor.
Great.
But,
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. Thanks both. Thank you very much for the presentations. Absolutely fantastic webinar for us this autumn. But thanks everybody for joining us.